I can understand why people would have troubles believing in God.
One difficulty we have in thinking about the question, does God exist, is the question, well, which God?
Jesus saw his role not to prove the existence of God, but rather to reveal who God is.
What Jesus said about the existence of God on this day of discovery.
This is the land of Abraham. When you look at the beauty of this Judean wilderness, you get the sense that things haven't changed here for a very long time. And here in Israel, among the people, it's also true that many things have not changed. Many here continue to believe in the faith of Abraham. Others, as in our own hometowns, for personal reasons, have lost the faith. And then there are a lot of people who, for practical reasons, are convinced that it really doesn't matter one way or the other whether one believes in the existence of God. Well, today we're going to hear from some who believe there are implications to whether or not we believe or not. But they're sensitive to the fact that many have a hard time believing in evidence for the existence of God, let alone for the kinds of things that Jesus said about him.
Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God."
Many have probably never thought about what Jesus said about God, but most have or have had questions about whether God exists at all.
The largest obstacle to believing in God is our suffering. It's as simple as that. You hear that everywhere you go, and it's been that way for centuries.
One of the main objections to God's existence that I would run into would be the suffering, the amount of suffering and pain that you see in the world. And that is a very good objection, honestly.
If he really is the Lord of the world, why do things break and people get broken in the process?
Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God."
If God exists, and he's perfectly good, then he would want to prevent suffering. But we suffer. If God exists and he was utterly powerful, omnipotent, powerful without qualification, then he could prevent our suffering. So he's good, and he's all-powerful, so he has the will as a good being to prevent our suffering, and the power as an omnipotent being to prevent our suffering. So why do we suffer?
Why do rapes happen? Why is there murders going on against senseless things? Why do women get abused by men and he just seems to turn an eye even when they're crying out to him, "Lord, help me," and nothing happens?
From the cross, even Jesus seemed to ask the kind of question that suffering people often ask.
Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Maybe God doesn't exist. Maybe God exists, but he's not good. Or maybe God exists, he's good, but he's not powerful enough to deal with our problems. This is a major obstacle to belief in God.
Jesus said, "If you had known me, you would have known my Father also."
How can you possibly believe that God is good and loving when that kind of stuff happens not just occasionally, but all the time? And the perpetrators of this kind of evil just walk free.
People are very skeptical about the existence of God today. I mean, they like to think of themselves as agnostic, those who really can't know. It's just not the kind of question that can be known. And so they kind of turn their back on the whole question, thinking that it's a hopeless pursuit.
But there are other problems as well. For example, today it's common to hear people say that truth is relative. You know, your truth is different than my truth, and what you believe may be true for you, but what I believe is true for me.
Jesus said, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.
I can understand why people would have troubles believing in God. I myself was not a person who believed in the existence of God until I was in college. And so when people tell me they have troubles with certain things, actually I remember being there myself. And one of the problems that I had personally was that God's not a physical presence with me. I can't just speak face to face with him. I don't see him physically on a daily basis. And everything that I was taught in my life was from a naturalistic point of view, that if I can't see it, test it, put it in a lab experiment, that it wasn't something I could know. And so this was a very difficult thing for me to understand. And I understand that part of how it's difficult to believe in a God that you can't immediately see. That's difficult, or experience from the five senses. You know, you can smell him, taste him, touch him, those sorts of things.
There are some today who would say that Christianity is not a credible worldview in which to believe because it can't be proven by science, as though if it's non-science, it's nonsense.
I think that skepticism is part of it for some people, but secularism is an attitude that God, even if God exists, is irrelevant to our lives. You can believe in God and be a secularist if it really doesn't matter, if God just seems completely distant.
For many people, they don't believe, not because the evidence is not good enough, but they may not like the implications of where they're going. What if they have to change their lifestyle? What if they need a new job? What if they can't talk to their kids the way they talk to them? What if they can't treat their wives or husband the way they do now? I mean, there's a lot of implications of Christianity, and it could be because I'm not ready for the implications, not because I can't explain away your evidence. So there's 100 reasons why people don't come to Christ. And you know, it's really, really special that we serve a God who lets us believe for good reasons, bad reasons, and lets us walk away, I think for bad reasons, but he lets you walk away.
Jesus said, "The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works."
What's interesting is that even though there's been a modern resurgence of atheism that says there is no God, research continues to show that the great majority of people in the United States continue to believe in God. The Gallup Research Group reports that 9 out of 10 continue to say that they do believe, and this is only slightly down since the 1940s. Another poll indicates that 72% say they are certain there is a God, 14% say God probably exists but have a few doubts, and only 3% say that they are certain that God does not exist.
One difficulty we have in thinking about the question, does God exist, is the question, well, which God? Which God are we talking about? And we're not just talking about religion here. And sometimes the word God gets mixed up with the word religion. What religion should I be? And what God should I believe in? But the fact is that there are some religions that deny the existence of God. They're religious, but they are not theistic. They don't affirm that God exists. Some do and some do not. So that's really a fundamental question.
Jesus said, "The first of all the commandments is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength.'"
Interestingly, Jesus said that to know him was to know God.
Jesus said, "If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him.
Although Jesus said his desire was to reveal what God is like, many have drawn their own conclusions. In 2006, Baylor University conducted a religion survey that described America's four gods. This survey concluded that 31.4% of Americans believe in an authoritarian, a stern, enforcer God. 23% believe in a benevolent, a giving, loving God. 16% believe in a critical, a judgmental, shaming God. 24.4% see God as being distant, out of reach, uninvolved, and 5.2% call themselves atheists, believing that God simply doesn't exist. The world of Jesus was even more religious than our own. In the days of the Roman Empire, everyone seemed to have some kind of belief in God or gods.
There was no such worldview which basically denied the existence of quote-unquote God. So there were no atheists like you and I would think of atheists today at that time. They believed in some deity, be it a pagan deity or believed in some kind of a force, a religious perspective that said ultimately there is some coherence to reality and there is a force behind this reality. So there was no such thing called atheism that was practiced from a modern perspective. When you and I think of the word atheism, we think of a person or an individual denying the existence of God. But that was not the case in the early church milieu or context.
Yet by the time Jesus left the scene, the things he had said about God caused his followers to be accused of being atheists, and even worse.
Well, the three popular charges that were leveled against early followers of Christ were atheism, cannibalism, and incest.
Because followers of Jesus would not bow to any other God, they were accused of atheism. Because they accepted a Jesus who told them to eat bread and drink wine as a way of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, they were accused of cannibalism. And because they spoke of loving one another as brothers and sisters, they were accused of incest.
Jesus said, "I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world."
The charge of atheism that was leveled against the early followers of Christ was a charge that basically said that these individuals did not practice the rituals of the Roman pagan religion. Now, atheism was not that they did not believe in the existence of God, it's that they did not practice the rituals. So irrespective of the worldview you held to, the religious worldview or faith you held to, if you did not practice the rituals that pertain to that faith, you were labeled as an atheist. So when you and I think of the word atheist or atheism, we basically think of a person who denies the existence of God. Right? And so that's not what atheism meant in the early church context.
No other place in the world is as closely linked to belief in one God as the city of Jerusalem. Here, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people agree that real spirituality is rooted in one God rather than many. But what they disagree about is what Jesus said about God. Where we see the real clash between Jesus and his Jewish culture is in what he said not only about God, but in the way he identified himself with God.
Jesus said, "I and my Father are one."
At this point, we're told that the Jewish religious leaders picked up stones to kill Jesus. When Jesus asked them why they wanted to kill him, they said it was because, as a man, he was claiming equality with God.
Jesus answered them, "Many good works I have shown you from my Father. "For which of those works do you stone me?" The Jews answered him, saying, "For a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God."
The unique feature of Judaism in the world of Jesus, at the time of Jesus, was that it was monotheistic. There was a belief in one God. In the surrounding cultures of the Greco-Roman world, they were predominantly polytheistic. They believed in many deities, many gods. Not all of them were good gods. There were good gods and bad gods, and oftentimes they were fighting against each other. But the real unique feature of Judaism was that they believed in one God, a good God. As Jesus came into that world, that was his understanding of who God was all about. It is one God. Behold, the Lord our God is one God. And Jesus grew up in that setting. Very soon, Jesus not only retained the understanding in Judaism of monotheism, but he threw a very interesting curve on that, where he now began to speak to the Father as his only Son. Now, is that now turning to polytheism? No. What Jesus was doing was letting us have a deeper insight into the very nature of God. That there is one God, one essence of God, but God is in three personal distinctions. That he is God the Son in relationship to God the Father. Now that is a mind-boggling concept. And for me, that probably is one of the most difficult paradigm shifts in human history. For good Jewish believers who are monotheists now to try to wrestle with understanding the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. There were personal distinctions, but they were of the same essence. In his giving the Great Commission just prior to him ascending back to the Father, Jesus gives a Great Commission to his disciples to make disciples of all the nations, and then to have them baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Whoa. Now we not only have two personal distinctions in the Godhead, but we have three. That is a profound understanding of who God is, and it helps us to understand the nature of the relationship between Jesus and his Father and the mission that the Father sent him to do.
If we believe that God exists and that God has existed from the beginning of time, is the creator of time and space, creator of our own existence, and created us with conscience and soul and all of these things, moral sensibilities, then it seems like a God like that would not want to leave us in despair, would not want to leave us in the dark, would not want to abandon or leave us alone on a sea of nothingness as cosmic orphans, as Sartre said. This isn't what he would want. So what would he want? He would want to do something about this. He would want to rescue us. Well, that's what any legitimate faith should explain, how God has done precisely that. Now, suppose you hear that this is how God has done this for us, through Jesus Christ. How would you know that it was true when there were other views about how God did this?
Jesus said, "Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves."
We got two choices at this point. One is to come out and say, "I'm it," you know, believe in me. And in the Gospel of John, we get some of that. Actually, in most of the material that we have in the Bible, though, we don't get that, which is a little kind of surprising. What we get is the evidence of God's care, the evidence of God's love, or saying things like, "I have the authority to forgive sins because I'm going to show you by something that doesn't normally happen that I have the authority to forgive sins." So he makes a paralytic who can't walk He gives them the ability to walk. He says that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on life to forgive sins. I say to you, get up and walk. And when the paralytic walks, his walk talks and says the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. He takes something you can't see and shows it by something that you can. And likewise, I think in thinking about the existence of God and Jesus' claims with reference to God, he takes something that you can't see. I mean, someone doesn't show up and say, I'm God. You know, he takes something you can't, but he demonstrates authority and the capability of doing things that you associate with God, so you say, God must be in our midst. That's the way he did it. Not through philosophy, not through logical argument, through demonstration.
Jesus saw his role not to prove the existence of God, but rather to reveal who God is. He said, no one has seen the Father except the Son. And so as a result of that, he said, if you see me, you have seen the Father.
Jesus said, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father.
We ask how Jesus pointed to the existence of God. In a very real sense, he pointed to himself as being the image or the reflection of God. The one who sees the Son sees the Father. If someone wants to know who the Father is, he can look to the Son. So in this relationship, Jesus portrays himself as kind of the visible, audio-visual image of who God is. And in that way points to God's existence. Their relationship was so close and so tight and so reflective of one another. You know, even though human beings are made in the image of God, put a little I on that. When we talk about Jesus, he's made in the image of God. Make that a capital I.
So while there are many reasons to avoid thinking about what Jesus said about God, no one has ever given us more reason to do so.
As in the first century, where there were lots of different masters in the world of Judaism and the wider Greco-Roman world, one finally had to make a determination as to which one is the right one, the good one. When Jesus came on the scene, he did not offer himself as just another option. He said, you are either with me or you are against me. It was not just one of many choices. In our day, we likewise have many, many choices of where we can place our allegiance. But Jesus calls us to himself personally and says, I'm not just a rabbi. I'm not just a revolutionary leader. I'm not just a great teacher, although he is all of those. He makes a claim that is virtually unheard of, and that is the claim to be sent by the Father as the one way to know the Father, and made the claim that he was not just a prophet or a priest or a king, but he was Lord. He was God in flesh. That's a radical claim that really deserves all of us to sit up and say, whoa, I better at least look into this.
And so the discussion continues. Is there a real God who made us in his own image? Or have we made him in our likeness? Interestingly, no other place in the world revolves around the question of the existence of God quite like the land, the people, and the story of Israel. And more specifically, we come to the question about Jesus. As we've heard today, is there evidence? Can we believe that when Jesus talked about coming to reveal the Father and to be God among us, that ends up not just being a matter of faith, but a matter of overwhelming evidence?
There's no question that Jesus changed history. He changed the debate about God by putting himself at the center of the argument, but not just to argue.
Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life."
you.